So I heard Brian Greene talking about just asking two simple questions in the course of a discussion. The questions weren't even being posed as answerable. But he said, effectively, what is dark matter? What is dark energy? And it immediately occurred to me that we only come to know things we discover in terms of things we already know. And most of the time, that's going to be a mistake, right? And then the other thing that occurred to me is we've confused our capacity to derive some function of a thing, because really what he's asking is not what is dark matter, what is dark energy. He's asking the physicist's question, in a sense, I think, what do they do, right? And so it seems in English and in our modern way of thinking, we confuse function with identity and believe that if we can derive some function of something we can in some way distinguish, right? Even with the simple language dark matter, we're pointing at a vague something. We're pointing at it in the direction of a question, really, because more than likely the fundamental assumptions we have about space and time are wrong, or childish, or extremely immature. Right? So, if we start from a position of understanding that we don't actually know what electrons are, we don't know what photons are. We don't know what quantum physics implies by existing. And again, it's not so much that we get to see the thing, only our peculiarly mechanical grasp on certain features of something. And this was coming up in the conversations about theories of everything. And Greene seemed to think that if Gödel was correct, and incompleteness is a fact over all systems, that would mean in essence, we'd be stuck in the between of always having failed systems. With theories of everything, depending on what we mean by the phrase, this becomes important because even with a theory of everything, the theory only exists in the language, equations, and minds of the only intelligent species we've acknowledged that does this kind of crazy stuff, with trying to figure out what the universe is by learning things about what it's doing. A theory of everything would necessarily entail completeness. And this is something we keep going after as humans. We want a totally complete system. But surely such a system would have to encompass the minds in which it is structured, the consciousness and the purposive, goal-seeking behavior that produces these models. And I think it's strange that we call them laws. I think that's very deceptive, because we should realize that our ability to predict the outcome of a situation mathematically or in a thought experiment does not in any way imply or entail that we actually understand the phenomenon. What it means is something much stranger, which is that we've been able to conceptualize and formalize in equations processes the true nature of which we haven't the slightest inkling. We have words like energy, space, time, light, space-time, dark matter, quasar, pulsar, star. And even if we've learned quite a bit about what our star sort of does and how to make predictions about it and so on, that doesn't imply at all that we understand what it is. Because to understand what it is, we'd have to... we would necessarily need to include the context, right? That which the phenomenon we have turned our attention toward is some kind of a hypostasis of, right? A lesser expression of the totality of. And since we don't know what the totality is, and I think we're pretty confused even about what space-time is, if we think of it in the terms of physics alone, we'll be blind. And yet physics has such trenchant authority in directing our thinking about this. And indeed, if another branch of knowledge has any, I don't know what it is. But if we think deeply about intelligence, and not just the way that humans embody this, but intelligence as a property of matter and organisms and stars, or even that it's fairly obvious that the mixture of the star and the earth and the water and time-space produces minds, right? And it's not really the proper domain of physics to explain this, though some people might like to think otherwise. Yeah. So, the problem with Greene's objections to Gödel is that Gödel's theory can be understood to insist, in a sense, and this is just one interpretation, and perhaps it's a flawed one, but it's not really important whether what I'm saying is true, rather whether it's useful. And it can be useful to understand Gödel's incompleteness theorems as formal mathematical proof that keeps us from pretending that our systems aren't our minds plus our systems. Right? And the idea of a perfect system is a system that supervenes over minds, right? And we have this troubling propensity as humans and scientists and researchers to think that the phenomenon and demand that the phenomenon and assert and prove that what we're looking at is mind independent, right, is, quote, the objective facts of the actual situation, unquote. And there's an incredible kind of hubris in this goal. And when it's limited to contexts in which it's actually useful, it's useful. But outside those contexts, it's very dangerous as an arbiter of identity or even explanatory authority. Whatever's going on in time-space is strange enough and beautiful enough and vital enough and more than merely alive enough that it produces minds. There's no way around that. Even if you say organisms and minds are an accident of time-space, right? It's pretty tough to draw a hard line between the universe and those things which it emits or is expressed as. So even if it's an accident, the universe is still expressing its own character and potential in the forms of nature and organisms and minds. Right? So the idea that you'd get a theory that you didn't need a mind for resembles, I think, some of the concerns of the logical positivist movement that was determined to place mathematics on an unassailable logical foundation. And in Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, they have a go at this for 25 years, I think. And eventually some 300 pages of piano arithmetic in, or more. Two things happen. The first is, essentially they have to say, well, if you accept certain axioms as implicit, 1 + 1 = 2, but there's the problem, that's not a complete system. And they failed, and Gödel's incompleteness theorems were a sort of formal assertion of the necessity of failure in any similar imperative, right? A complete system. I think the idea with the logical positivists was that in theory, if we could place mathematics on a firm logical foundation, we would then very soon possess the mechanical capacity to compute any problem, and thus could have perfect knowledge. It's a bold quest, and one I'm so glad we've undertaken. If only because it helped us to understand the necessity of incompleteness in formal systems, because without minds, formal systems aren't systems at all, and aren't even formal. And you can't collapse the mind into the system, right? So that you no longer have to have something transcendental to the language and the math and the theories that can determine not just their validity, but their degrees of validity under certain constraints, or relieved of certain constraints. So I think what incompleteness has to do with theories of everything is that, first of all, we should say, as Brian responsibly did, when physicists sometimes use this term, they may mean different things, and hopefully they'll tell us what they mean. But essentially they mean something like the theory that unifies quantum mechanics, relativity, and its subsets like Newtonian physics, which is could be understood as a special case of relativity, right? Unifies these things because presently they're quite distinct, and that's problematical. It means there's something we don't know yet, which of course there always will be. But I think the other weird problem with the idea of a theory of everything, which essentially is going to account for the particles and the quantum things we know, and unify them, and show how perhaps the space of relativistic physics is a subspace of quantum physics. And it doesn't look that way. It looks like, from what I understand anyway, they're wildly distinct and kind of don't pay attention to each other. But the fact that that might generally be true doesn't mean there's no link space, right? Where they definitely, either one has precedence or they, dance together. I think the humans in general get way ahead of themselves. having failed to understand anything like the nature of time-space or what light is about or is an expression of, we've taken the function for the identity. And whenever we derive a function, we think we then know, or we act like we know in language, what something is. And it's absolutely clear that knowing what light doesn't tell us what it is. And the same is true really with anything. You know, we humans have a funny game when we meet. We might, particularly males, right? We'll say, oh, hey, what do you do? Right? As if by the person telling us their function, we know who the person is. And clearly you can see that's largely impossible. There are some trivial exceptions and a few modest ones. But, and of course it does tell us something about them. But it's an example of that inclination to substitute function for identity in our thought and in our language, right? So when Brian Greene's asking, what is dark matter? And he's asking the question sort of rhetorically when he's using that language, in that he doesn't expect it to be answered. I think what he really means is, what does it do? Because physics isn't in the business of determining the identity of things, but rather in understanding how to place a framework over what we can sense and intuit to test speculations about what it does, but not what it is. Yeah. And necessarily that quest produces a bunch of new ises, hopefully. But yet again, we run into the problem of we tend to cognize new things, new reference for language and thought and experiment, like dark matter or quasars. We tend to categorize them according to and in comparison with, quote, things we already know about, unquote. Thus you get the idea, for example, that the heart is a pump. Right? And yeah, it does the pumping thing, that's for sure. But to confuse that with its identity, we're throwing away most of what's going on for the sake of the tangible authority of it going boom, 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 you know, right? It's actually doing that. You know, there's a goal of something like explicit objectivity. And mathematics and physics have about them the stink of this goal. Equations rarely rely on interpretation. Their structure is fundamentally authoritative, in part because it's internally consistent. But I'm reminded of Riemann and whatever crazy intuition led him to suppose that the inversion of the Euclidean axiom, parallel lines never meet, would give us a new vision of the nature of geometry. Whatever time-space is up to, and we see pieces of that, right? We, at least for a little while now, have had the conceptual idea that this is a solar system in a galaxy, in a group of galaxies, in a particular region of time-space and the universe. And we know that around here, planets are said to orbit the sun, and that something at least vaguely approximating that is really going on. Depending, of course, on what we mean by orbit and who's asking and a few other things. So, you know, the whole idea of space as like the interval between worlds or stars is pretty damn young. I'm not really sure how old it is. And prior to that, I think we thought of the sky as at least resembling waters of some kind. But maybe not the regular kind. And that might have been smarter than the way we think of it now as an effectively blank interval between condensed objects in space-time. I don't think that stuff's empty. And I suspect it has properties and functions that we've so far been too unimaginative to conceive of or even speculate toward. Somehow the theories have been promoted over the minds in which they arise. And that seems a step too far for me. Surely no theory will encompass the minds in which theories arise. That would mean you had a perfect theory. That would mean Gödelian incompleteness was false. The simple way to say something about Gödel was that effectively one of the incompleteness theories, and he has two, says something like no formal system of a complexity level sufficient to generate arithmetic will be consistent if it is complete. In other words, the consistency of the system requires incompleteness. And some people have opined, one person that I know directly, Kevin Baru, have implied that perhaps Gödel had an intuition about the problem of a system that doesn't need a mind in which to become structured and form and arise. Sometimes it seems like the physicists are kind of religious about certain rules, in the sense that they almost see the rules as like self-existent roots. They see them in the functional position of a divine being because of their seeming degree of truth, right? Light travels 186,000 miles per second in a vacuum or something like this, right? Or the Planck equations, Schrodinger's equations, many other equations, relativity, fine structure constant, lots of stuff. And I wouldn't say their reverence is misguided, but we need a different kind of knowledge. We need the kind of knowledge that helps us understand what the hell is going on, because it isn't just a bunch of particle interactions. Hopes and prayers of certain physicalists aside. There's no way that's true. There's something fundamental going on, and physics, and perhaps science itself, are not the kind of tool we need to discover it. In fact, the hidebound physicalism of many aspects of modern science is misguided. They have a love of detail, but don't understand the context. And human knowledge has this inclination to produce endless little branches of knowledge about pieces and function, and perhaps relationship between the pieces, but it's very rudimentary, and it takes forever to go a little ways unless you get lucky and stumble on a fundamental insight. The problem is that function doesn't tell us what electrons are, or why there are electrons, or why it appears to us that there's a limit to the signal transmission speed of light, which has to be the fastest transmission speed that we can imagine, given what physics has revealed to us about the physical things, yeah, and the energetic things, and so on. So we don't have any other way of knowing to lead us in this direction. And something like a unity of physics, biology, philosophy, and what we might call seeking would be much more likely to produce progress in that domain than physics by itself. If the universe were fundamentally intelligent, this is the last thing you'd expect to hear from a physicist, because they'd have no grasp on it. How do you measure the mind with which you measure? If you go looking at physical reality and the nature of organisms and their relationships and their character, right? You have to include that thing that science tends to get rid of, the unique character of any individual situation or circumstance. The goal of the physical experiment is to get rid of that. No, you sweep that stuff aside, it's not reliable. It's not that it's not reliable, it's just that you can't get a formal grip on it. Though, the possibilities of modern heuristic learning computational systems, which would be, or even heuristic developing systems, which might be my two-wordy translation of what people mistakenly refer to as artificial intelligence. I think we should be really careful about that term. We who are not yet very intelligent are about to build actual intelligences in machines. Okay. I mean, some kind of tragic, melodramatic comedy skit probably ensues if that goes forward. I just don't believe that what machines do is the same thing as intelligence. I would happily classify it as a subset, right? But I wouldn't call it intelligence, and I very much doubt that something muchly resembling minds will emerge in that regard. Though I could easily be proven wrong. I'm half on the fence. I think we should preserve a fundamental distinction between minds like ours, the minds that build machines, and the relatively straight up mechanical results of our building those machines and setting them on certain tasks and so on. That phenomenon that happens inside the machine is mechanical computation and pretty much nothing else. Now, there might be some mechanical computation going on in our brains, and if we use that lens to look at our brains, we will certainly see something that resembles mechanical computation. But there are 30 other important lenses that we should be using 6 or 7 of. Whatever's going on in there is not and cannot be merely mechanical computation. And even if it's computation, I think biocomputation, whatever that might mean, is a different thing than what happens in computers. There's this ancient sort of idea that it's possible to make something that's so complex and sophisticated that it somehow magically transcends being mechanical. The problem with the humans is we can always redefine fundamental root terms and ideas in such a way that our physical creations, our artifacts, satisfy the new definition. And this is what I think is very dangerous in our thinking, because the fact that machines simulate the process we call learning does not mean they are learning. We shouldn't use the word learn for what they're doing, because what they're actually doing is a complex, layered filtering of databases to solve problems that they've been structured to receive as input. And when you do that over and over again on vast data sets, you get a structured result that's highly effective in certain limited ways. But I'm not ready to call that intelligence, and I don't think training the database is equivalent to learning. The learning word should stay with the biologicals, in my view. Probably forever, but at least for the foreseeable future. So the goal of creating a mind within a machine is a fascinating goal, and now that we have such machines, it's hard to not feel some of the gravity in that direction. My first interest in computers orbited that specific goal, which was the possibility of building a friend. But implicit in that goal was something much stranger. It was the desire to know a non-human intelligence and something that might be truly intelligent as opposed to the stuff we're bumbling around with here on Earth mostly. So in a sense, it was similar to the goal of wanting to meet and converse and get to know, converse with and get to know an alien. A being from another world or universe. Now, of course, I can tell that I'm surrounded by incredibly sophisticated intelligences, at least equal and many far surpassing the strange representational intelligence of humans. But I know firsthand that the nature of time-space is nothing like an empty interval between the physically condensed objects and the nebulae and the galaxies and pulsars and black holes and these functional objects. We're trained to think they're doing something, and we're trained to think of them as objects, right? In a sense, they're often thought of as machines. But I would argue that even given the physics knowledge that we've acquired and the small degree of knowledge of the sun we've acquired, the sun is being something in time-space. It might be more correct to say the sun is being someone in time-space, and it is fulfilling roles that physics nearly must fail to conceive of, and so too the Earth and the Moon. These are not merely the phenomena that physics can reveal to us. We don't know what they are. No one knows what the sun is. In bald point of fact, without the sun, there would not be any knowing, right? Knowing is a side effect of what the sun is and is doing. And we have no grasp of this as moderns. I'm not asking us to be religious, I'm asking us to be realistic. If we understand anything about how things arise and depart in time-space, from the cell to an animal to a mountain to a forest to the earth to the sun, then we realize that there are root phenomena without which we wouldn't be having theories about anything. No earth, no theories. No rivers and oceans, zero theories. Sun goes away, the whole concept of meaning is gone. There are no more minds around here. Right? So we must understand that our minds, I think it's at least crucial to entertain the idea that our minds are peculiar crystallizations or lesser expressions of, hypostases of, the nature of time-space. You're not going to get a theory that encompasses that. You'd have to skip back before there were minds, right? A true theory of everything is formally impossible, and probably this is mathematically provable, using something similar to what Gödel used to prove this about formal systems in general. You're not going to capture the minds in which theories arise. And the other problem here is that almost all these things are infinite topics. They're not topics where you get to some rung on the ladder and now you're done. Now you know what everything is, right? Now you know what everything does and why it does it and why there are things at all instead of nothing and so on, right? That still doesn't tell you what they are. The nature of minds is the nature of beings in relation with each other, orbiting this star in time-space. And it's the relationships that determine identity, not the functions. And I'm not arguing that we should, be angry at physicists or anything like this. That's nothing like what I'm saying. Physics is going to continue and develop, and is one of the most profound paths of knowledge we have. But why is it off in a corner by itself? We could do without the religiosity that believes that physics tells us what things are. It never does that. All it does is communicate properties of features of reality that we can distinguish. And let's face it, we're not all that good at distinguishing them yet. We've been doing this formally for 150 years, 200 years? Not very long, an eye blink. I think if we develop well as humans, if we develop our cognition and our awareness properly, we'll get something that transcends physics, that physics is a special case of, in the same way that Newtonian physics is a special case of relativity and so on. Right? I think we'll find a way of knowing that gives us an entirely different motivation for asking these questions. The motivation having to do more with the nature of intelligence than with particles, and the nature of organisms and biocognitive hypersystems and the kind of phenomenon that our minds arise from here on Earth, moment to moment. It's kind of bizarre that we think we could travel in space for a long time, because it supposes strange things like human minds can exist out of proximity with the sun. That might not be true, right? There's a lot we don't know about minds and the sun and their linkages, yeah? And also that we could exist separated from the biosphere. Of course, it seems likely, thinking about it rationally, but there are lots of reasons why it's unlikely that we've not been imaginative enough yet to consider. In any case, function isn't identity. And to know identity is a personal thing. You have to have something like a personal relationship with what you're knowing the identity of, somehow, right? And this is part of the promise of religion. You'll have a personal relationship with the transcendental as God, or beings, or shunyata. You'll have a personal experience, a direct, first-hand, not in equations, not in logic, not in thinking, right? In the root of yourself, you'll directly experience the divine. This is the promise. The physicists, most of them, many of whom may be physicalists, want us to think that either the idea of anything transcendental to our common ways of thinking is unnecessary and can't be tested, so never mind. Right? Well, it's not true that it can't be tested, even if it's a little shy, first off. But it's so ironic because the minds with which they formulate these concerns are transcendental to those concerns. And the minds in which they formulate anything are transcendental to anything that they formulate. And so there's always this feature of like a cat chasing its tail in a circle, because those who want a truly complete theory, or who want us to think, for example, that the universe is fundamentally computational, or in a wildly ridiculous assertion, the universe is a simulation. And they probably have a special meaning for simulation, right? But if we take it as the ordinary meaning, it's truly ridiculous and silly. That's probably a mistake of interpretation, nonetheless. There's the simple root question. Is it true, and how could we know, if it were, that the phenomena of our experience are purely physical and have no transcendental properties? Well, that can't be true, because even if they're purely physical, whatever that might mean, which is hard to understand, actually. Even if they were as we conceive of them, in the grave simplicity of our conceptions, we would all admit that they have qualities, properties, functions, interactions, and relationships that we are not only unaware of, we either don't have a concept for at all, and thus could not notice, or would be very unlikely to notice. And some percentage of these it would be impossible for us to become aware of, regardless of how sophisticated our equations became. So all features of our experience must have like a layered array of things we are either extremely unlikely to know, things we don't know, things we are extremely unlikely to know, things that are nearly impossible to know, things we specifically can't know, and so on. And since they have all these properties and qualities, necessarily, due to the limitation of our grasp of them, they must be mostly transcendental to our knowledge. It's not like, oh yeah, we got this really good knowledge now. We know 90% of what a tree is doing. Not even kind of. We probably know 3% or less of what a tree is or is doing. If we summed human knowledge, all the different knowledge ways, traditional ways, all these things, we might get 3 or 5%, maybe, if we're lucky, I think. So most of what's going on must be transcendental to how we think about it, and this is probably more true of physics than anything else. So let's start there. Let's start with this admission, this open admission. We know next to nothing. And whatever's going on must be far stranger than the way we're thinking and writing and doing equations about it, because we're still in kindergarten as a species. Though there are examples of advancement beyond, maybe even high school here and there. To torture my analogy, when I look up at the sky, the star field, I certainly don't see empty space. And perhaps I haven't acquired the profound awareness and knowledge of the ancient peoples in their seeming simplicity. They're deceptive. They're seemingly deceptive simplicity. The introduction of math and physics and the sciences has produced a strange kind of authorization schema in the human cognitium. And it's natural in a way because it's so irrefutable. Right? The predictions work is the problem. And there's very few other ways of knowing that give you a mechanical grasp on predicting the future, and in some cases reconstructing the past, the future of some system, right? And of course the more we limit the system, the better our predictions become. So I guess I'm not just arguing for more humility, I'm arguing for insight that recognizes the limitations of the methods and systems thus far acquired and elucidated. But I'm also concerned about the effect on our lexicon. There are root elements in our lexicons. They're simple words like star, world, animal, plant, I, dream, food, friend. Simple words. Sun, moon. I think for most of human history, the sky was seen as a realm of beings, and the star was at least a being, the sun. And the planets were beings. And we might think that we've, progressed by having filtered off this troubling, quaint idea. But it's a mistake. They're not ordinary beings like humans, but they're up to something. They're being someone in the family of beings in time-space. And it's very important not to think of them as objects. Anything that affects the complexity and connotation web of the root elements in our lexicon makes us dumber by leaps and bounds. Yeah? It results in a kind of lossy compression of identity in consciousness and thought, where we get too much artifact and not enough vital ambiguity, incompleteness. It's easy to believe we can know the functions of an object. It's impossible to believe we can know the nature of another being, except in personal and communal relation. We like to think that minds have no effect on the structure of our math and our theories. I think that's absurd. I think minds that developed on another world would have math and a perspective, a fundamental perspective on identity that differs from ours. And could be at once vastly less mechanical and far more effective. Probably turns out that in time-space, it's not what you know, it's who you know. I suspect that it's very likely that we would discover that the nature of dimensionality, intelligence, and time-space are intimately interwoven at the core. And that there are ancient civilizations communicating regularly between each other in time-space, and more than likely they have some rather important array of goals that they're pursuing. Certainly they're up to much more than mere observation. And one can imagine factions, because as humans we tend to break up into them with different goals. But one can also imagine the opposite of factions. Really coherent unity of goals. And I think whatever's going on the big, in the big picture, it seems very likely to me that living worlds are always touching. All of them. I don't know whether the communication is instantaneous, but I have many models of situations where the myriad intelligences in time-space are instanced here as organisms and relationships between them. So that you don't have to travel anywhere. It's literally all right here. But the models don't come from me thinking about it, they come from direct experience. And I'm not claiming that my experience is definitive or authoritative, but something is missing from the idea of the universe as a bunch of functions and no beings. It's beings that have that idea. Without beings, you don't get ideas like that, right? Certainly that's a modest subset of the ideas that would enlighten us. I love listening to the physicists talk, and many of them I think are actually quite heroic. Gödel, I think, was heroic as well. But Brian Greene is heroic. I love Roger Penrose. I love to hear him speak. He's a mind of incredible depth. And sincerity and passion. So I'm certainly not against the physicists. I'm against the physicists. No, I'm not against anything. I'm in favor of us having caution about us confusing the difference between the functions we derive of features we can distinguish in physics and what is and what the universe is and is doing and is being. Because that latter thing, we need to understand the context. If we don't understand... It's funny. We need, actually, a kind of impossible thing. We need a system of knowledge to have a personal experience. And I could hear a million scientists cringe there. But the scientists are having personal experiences of their own research, so where's the problem? Because we're not going to get the knowledge of identity and meaningful origin, right, from science. And I'm not going to claim we'll get it from religion either. Both of these are ways of knowing. But the questions are transcendental to our sciences, you see. And they must be thus. And they will always be thus. Nonetheless, I mean, honestly, the physicists are dangerous. These days, the branches of science we call physics and biology, and physics subsumes all of machines, are the most dangerous things in the human arsenal for weapon making. Yeah. All of our weapons are the result of physics and biology. And all of our machines are pretty much weapons, whether we conceive of them thus or not. Clearly, as a species, we need to graduate from yeah, this is the old problem, isn't it? So, for probably 1,000 years, but particularly the last couple of hundred, our species has invested something resembling its developmental potential into bizarre and deadly swarming sort of systems of ignorance and deprivation. And most of this is in service to building machines. And so it's as if we've taken the peculiar gift of our unique evolutionary endowments and bled them off into technological development, having failed utterly and completely to even begin the project meaningfully of anything resembling intelligent societies, benevolent, peaceful, altruistic societies, societies that at least had the capacity for some semblance of ecological symbiosis with the life systems of Earth. But instead, as a group, we are voraciously omnicidal. We're trying to kill everything in new ways per second, and we're profligate with our technologies, having pretty much zero consideration for their effect on biology, the biosphere, ourselves, our children, and thus by affecting ourselves and our children, affecting our ancestors, so on. Because to the degree we fail to achieve the dreams that lived in the hearts of our ancestors. And often these were dreams of communion, not dreams of gain, dreams of insight, not of knowledge. Dreams of the fulfillment of the promise of our incarnation as human beings on earth in the times we are born. Not machines, not computers, not missiles, not bombs, not sonar that blows the insides of whales apart so that we can get oil from under the sea or map terrain for our submarines. Not that. So somehow the humans have to begin to passionately pursue the possibility of social and ecological intelligence and relational intelligence, so that we might have the opportunity to know in relation what the sun, who the sun is, what the earth, who the earth is, who they are being in the local time-space families. And in case it's not clear, whatever they may be, we're doing the opposite. We're tearing the earth apart. We're making it impossible for her to be who she is in time-space. If there's a network of intelligent worlds and the earth is a part of it, we're fucking up the local node catastrophically. That behavior will not go unpunished. Not because the universe is concerned with retribution, but more in the same way our own immune system works, right? The network of living worlds has something transcendental to but resembling an immune system. And it will certainly separate any node that goes rogue and starts building mad machines and killing up everything that it can possibly touch. Yeah, unfortunately us moderns are omnicidal and we're unaware. There are no bodies of awareness. The societies are fictions, mostly dead processes manned by humans. So I would argue that we need to retrieve our developmental momentum and assets from technology and deploy them in the direction of the great experiment that will produce many unique, intelligent societies, fundamentally benevolent, peaceful, altruistic, ecologically sensitive, a whole new way for humans to be humans together that's older than anything we could call a government. But how to foment such a revolution? Do let me know your ideas. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again soon.